Hungry Dads.
Welcome to Hungry Dads, your guided tour through the delicate and often overwhelming balancing act between food indulgences and social acceptance. And now, as always, here are your hosts, Rod Budget and Hugh Gallon.
Hello and welcome to episode 41 of Hungry Dads. I'm Rod Budget.
I'm Hugh Gallon. Hello, hello.
And Hugh, I'm sure you're well aware by now, but the Lay's Do Us a Flavor 2015 finalists were announced this afternoon. And get this, folks, we did not win. Shocking.
I can't believe it.
I'm a little shocked. I'm a little dismayed, but life moves on. And let's talk about the four finalists briefly. We have Southern Biscuits and Gravy, kettle-cooked Greek Town Gyro, Giro, or Hero, Hugh?
Gyro in my part of the world.
New York Reuben, and finally West Coast Truffle Fries. So some initial thought, they struck me as pretty safe and at the same time intriguing chip flavors, if that makes sense. None of these were like super outlandish, but then when I started thinking about them as potato chip flavors, some of these I think are pretty unique and pretty out there.
I thought the flavors themselves, all of them sounded worth trying. None of them piqued my interest or grossed me out in an extreme way. I'm definitely interested in trying each one. I think they were good choices. I'll elaborate in a little bit, but in the end, I actually like the choices. And I really mean this. I think they're better than anything I submitted.
Yeah, I mean, I have a few nitpicks, but overall, I think they're solid. I think, as we said in episode 20, I told you they were looking for these homespun tales, Taste of America. That's what they went with for the most part. I'll just run down some brief thoughts on each flavor. Southern Biscuits and Gravy, I thought, was not super original. It's kind of a flavor that would have popped in my head or may have even popped in my head. But as a chip, I'm intrigued to try Biscuits and Gravy. I think it's an audacious flavor experiment. I like Biscuits and Gravy, so I don't know.
I imagine it's going to taste like salt and pepper flavored chips. Do you have salt and pepper flavored chips where you are?
We do, and it's actually one of my favorites, and I have them quite a bit. I'm interested in seeing how they get the biscuit flavor to translate. Next up is the kettle-cooked gyro, the Greek Town gyro, which, of all the flavors, this is the one I kind of think is weird or gross, and maybe that's what they're going for. The flavor itself, I don't have strong feelings about, other than I think it sounds a little unappealing.
Yeah, listen, America's a melting pot, so Greek Town is as much America as anything else. But it's not pure Americana, which was the call of the contest. So I agree. I think flavor-wise, I'm as interested as anything. I don't think it sounds unappealing. As far as fitting the theme of Taste of America, it's Greek. I mean, it's a Greek thing. It's not an American thing, any more than, maybe Tex-Mex is or anything like that. So I'm not judging it. It isn't really the Taste of America as I would have expected it.
Next up is the New York Reuben, and Hugh, out of all the flavors, I'm most interested to get your take on the New York Reuben. It sounds maybe the most delicious potentially to me, or the top two. Reubens are delicious. You got cheese, you've got meat, but Hugh, are Reubens, is that a New York thing?
No, I mean, it isn't any more than New York offers a lot of different great kinds of food. And a New York pastrami sandwich is a New York thing. Now, a Reuben is pastrami, right? Have I got that right?
I believe that's correct. So I guess it's kind of the Pilot High type sandwich.
No, I took them to be maybe a diner food. I mean, I don't think Reubens, they might have originated in New York, but they don't pop to my mind as of the many foods that New York can lay claim to. I don't think a New York Reuben is top of the list.
Yeah, I guess that's my only problem with this one is I feel like you could put New York in front of pretty much any food and it would make sense. So
if they'd have said New York pastrami, I think they would have been onto something. But a New York Reuben per se, yeah, I don't think I don't know it to be uniquely New York. I'll say this about this and the gyro hero. I think capturing the flavor in a chip in any real way is actually going to be pretty hard. It's going to taste like any number of salty flavored chips with some sort of spice in it. It probably will taste fine, but I don't expect this one to capture the flavor of a Reuben in any real sense.
I think as Do Us a Flavor goes on, it's going to get more and more difficult because, I mean, these food scientists and flavor doctors are amazing, but like you said, after a while, everything just kind of is going to taste very similar. I mean, if you have a cheese-based chip and a sour cream and onion-based chip, they're obviously not going to taste the same. But when you start getting these crazy flavors, I'm really curious, are Biscuits and Gravy going to taste drastically different than the Reuben or the Giro Hero? And last but not least, the West Coast truffle fries. And this is the one I take the biggest issue with as far as a West Coast thing. It seems like they just threw West Coast in front of truffle fries. I googled West Coast truffle fries to see if it was a thing. It doesn't seem to be. It sounds a little bit foodie, which relates to the West Coast. I know garlic fries are a big thing in San Francisco, but truffle fries, I don't know. They sound delicious, though. I think of all the flavors, this one just sounds the most delicious to me.
Yeah, I think this is the one that lends itself most to the chip, and it does seem like it's within shooting range of actually tasting like the thing it's asserting to be. I actually don't love truffle fries. I've had them. I'm interested to try them as a chip. I don't expect this to be my favorite of them, but I do expect it to hit the mark on what it's purporting to offer.
Well, there you have it. Congratulations to the 4 finalists. I'm sure everyone is in shock, as we are, that neither Hugh or myself are finalists, but we will move on. Hungry Dad.
Rod, long before we started this podcast, I was already a huge fan of the podcast medium. I was intrigued and interested when you said, let's start a podcast. And one of the reasons I really wanted to do it is because I think podcasts really are such a fantastic medium. For me, I consume more podcasts than I do any other types of media. I listen to podcasts more than radio. I watch it more than TV at this point, to be perfectly honest, and I'm not saying I'm in the majority here. The great thing about podcasts is that they are largely free of charge. They're immune to cancellation. They're democratic. They cover an entirely large array of interest areas, and they're absent most forms of censorship or creative restriction. I mean, we're clear evidence of that. No one's canceling us. No one's censoring us. We're doing whatever we want. It doesn't make any sense.
We're crazy.
It doesn't matter if anyone's listening. We just keep doing it. And they're very easy to find and sample and check out. And I really wish more people listen to podcasts, in part because we have a podcast and I think we have a lot to offer, and I think I would like more people to listen to us. But if not us, then I want everyone to find something they would like to listen to in a podcast. And I want to urge our listeners right now, you're listening to a podcast right now, you've been introduced to podcasts, tell a friend about podcasts. Check out some other podcasts for yourself, and that's where I want to go tonight. I want to pay tribute to, share with our audience my love of podcasts by giving kind of a quick review and a rundown of the podcasts I listen to. And some of them are food-based, as ours is. Some of them aren't food-based, but actually happen to have a perhaps surprising amount of food-related content. And that's what I'm going to focus on.
Yeah, I'm certainly not the podcast expert that you are. I knew you were a early adopter. I think podcasts strike a lot of people as bizarre because it doesn't seem technologically forward-thinking, or, you know, we have all this technology now, and what, we're going to just listen to audio? Like, radio's been around forever. But really what podcasts are is audio on demand, and it makes perfect sense because video on demand has taken off over the past 5 to 10 years, and you can sit down and watch video or TV whenever you want to, and you're in control. Well, the same thing's happened with audio, and there's even more content out there. Pretty much anything you can think of or dream of, I can almost assure you there is a podcast out there talking about it.
Absolutely. So I'm going to focus on food and food-related topics, even with some podcasts that might not seem like they're related to food. And in fact, the first one I'm going to mention, you would at first be surprised, has so much food-related content. It's called Planet Money. It's an NPR podcast, and it's about money and economics and things like that. But it's way too much fun to be described as as a financial or an economics podcast. I mean, really, I gotta convince anyone who's listening not to be turned off by the idea that it's called Planet Money. It's about human and real-world stories and lots of food-centric episodes. We actually springboarded off of one of their episodes. In our second episode, they had episode 554, which was how the burrito became a sandwich. And it analyzed New York State tax law that defines a sandwich. And again, it was way more interesting than the way I just described it. They did a different turn, but they basically asked similar questions to what we asked. What constitutes a sandwich? Another really interesting one was episode 399. It was entitled, Can You Patent a Steak? And it featured a meat scientist to frame a story about patents. But this guy was literally cutting up cows in order to invent a new cut of meat. Like, invent a new cut of meat. So what I've done here, and this will be the first example, is I share these podcasts with you Rod and with our audience, I've kind of broken down for most of them, like maybe a couple of bullets. And I'm going to share kind of maybe something I learned that I think is interesting. Then I'm going to ask you a question, kind of like a trivia question, see if you happen to know the answer to it. And then I'm going to ask another question that I'm not going to give the answer to. If you want the answer, you're going to have to pull up the podcast and give it a listen, folks. My goal here is to get you hooked on these great podcasts.
That's a great idea.
So first, let me tell you about this Planet Money episode. There is a patent registered with the U.S. government right now, and I'm quoting from the patent, quote-unquote, method of cutting an elongated meat product. What this patent is for a hot dog cut up into little strips and breaded and fried. It's a cross between French fries and a corn dog, and it's called the Frank fries. This is patented, and I think it's genius and delicious.
I think it should be called Frankenfries, but otherwise, I agree.
A mix-up between French fries and a corn dog. I think it sounds delicious. Now, again, what they're telling you about is that this is something that someone patented. And what that means is the inventor of this has a monopoly for the first 20 years on it. And so they're the only ones who can sell and distribute Frank fries unless you pay them a licensing fee. Now, here's my trivia question. This one might be a little tough, but I'm going to throw it at you anyway. What frozen steak meat sandwich was invented by a guy named Gene Gagliardi, who was annoyed that Philly cheesesteaks, the meat would slide out of it when you tried to bite down?
Frozen steak
meat sandwich. Have you ever heard of Steakums?
No.
You've never heard of Steakums? Oh, all right.
So I probably wouldn't have gotten it right.
Okay, so there's a thing called Steakums, and I remember Steakums, and they're still around. They're basically, this guy invented a new type of meat, and what he experienced was that Philly cheesesteaks were like when you bite out, it slides out. So he took this meat and like ground it in a certain way and put holes in it, kind of, so that you could bite through it. And so that's a steakum. Here's the mystery question. I'm not going to answer it for you. You're going to have to check out the podcast. What chain restaurant brought Gagliardi's patent, quote unquote, method for making a food product from the thigh of a bird? For a bonus point, what was their product? I'll give you a shot to answer. I just won't tell you if you're right or not.
KFC seems obvious.
You might be right.
Yeah.
Yep. And I'll you know what? First time I'll give our listeners the answer. This is KFC's popcorn chicken. He patented it. He sold it to KFC, and basically, it made enough money off of a couple of these inventions where he can continue to be a quote-unquote meat scientist.
I want to be a meat scientist.
If you hit a couple of patents that fly, this man did very well for himself. So a couple other episodes of note from Planet Money that were food-centric was episode 627 entitled The Miracle Apple. And what they described there is that you used to only be able to buy a couple type of apples, basically a red, a yellow, and a green. And they actually all tasted kind of crummy. But in the last 10 years, there's been grocery stores offering all these new brands like the Pink Lady and these creative names. They go through the history of how did this happen? How did we go from just having red and green and yellow apples to having these name brand apples? And the answer is copyright, actually. Another great episode they had was called The Chocolate Curse, where they explained that chocolate is never going to taste as good as it used to because the chocolate plants that they use to make cocoa or whatever are starting to die. So they're having to crossbreed them in a lower quality and make up the difference with other products. So good chocolate will soon be extinct.
That's depressing.
Yeah. But apparently the pedestrian palates will not notice the difference.
My Reese's peanut butter cups will not be affected.
Exactly.
Hungry Dads.
The next podcast I want to talk about is one I think maybe I'm not going to say everyone's heard about it, but anyone who listens to podcasts or listens to public radio is going to have heard of This American Life. Have you heard of This American Life?
I have. I've heard of Planet Money even. So
okay. So, and these are both NPR. I'm not going to concentrate completely on NPR, but I thought I'd kick it off with those because they're both pretty popular. So This American Life is perhaps the best and the best known podcast and radio show out there right now. It's hosted by NPR rock star Ira Glass. He's one of my heroes. If you haven't heard of it at all, just turn off our podcast right now and go start listening to This American Life. You'll probably never come back to our podcast, but it's okay because theirs is this good.
It's hard to believe.
One of the episodes, probably the episode that got me hooked, is this one. Episode 44, and it's called Doppelgangers. And it's a classic episode that explores a question that I didn't know existed. Is some of the calamari that's served in restaurants actually cut up pig rectum, seasoned and fried? And if so, could a taste test reveal the difference? Did you follow that?
I think, yeah, it's not what I was expecting, but I did follow.
So they follow a apparent urban legend that a good amount of the calamari served in restaurants could be sliced pig rectum.
And now I can never eat calamari again.
Well,
now that I think about it, it's very rubbery, and picturing a pig's rectum, that's kind of what I would picture the texture being like.
So here's one of the interesting things I learned. Seafood counterfeiting is a thing. DNA testing showed... so you're familiar with seafood counterfeiting? What do you know about seafood counterfeiting?
I know there's a lot of lobster imitation lobster. A lot of places get in trouble for that and advertising it as lobster. And I think just fish in general, there's higher quality fish and lower quality fish, and restaurants are often trying to advertise it as being one type of fish when it's really not as good as they're saying.
Exactly. And they shared the results of a study that said in California, it was like 50% of the seafood you get is not what they say it is. Now, it's not all pig rectum. Pig rectum is a thing that is served in some cultures, and they spoke with some of the cultures, some chefs that might prepare pig rectum. What do you think the hardest part is about preparing pig rectum?
The hardest part about preparing a pig rectum, I don't know, cleaning it of bacteria.
It's actually the obvious, removing the taste of poo.
Well, yeah.
So you have to do significant soaking and blanching to remove the taste of poo. Now,
deep fat frying, probably.
Here's what the reporter did. They had a chef prepare 2 plates. One, fried calamari, real calamari. The other one, fried sliced pig rectum. 2 taste testers were picked, and then based on just looking at it, each one picked what they thought the real thing was. And each person picked a different one. So someone ate the pig rectum. What happened next? Did the rectum eater know that he ate pig rectum? Listen to find out.
Oh, jeez.
Episode 44, Doppelgangers.
All I can think of is calamari at bowling alleys, because they seem to have it at bowling alleys a lot. And I
I
always
never heard of that.
I always think to myself, why is there calamari at the bowling alley? Fried calamari. And now I've got to question that.
They never mentioned bowling alley calamari, but it does seem if the pig rectum were to show up anywhere, it would be at the bowling alley.
That's where it would be. Hungry Dads.
Moving away from NPR for a minute, I want to go in a completely different direction and tell our audience about Welcome to Night Vale. It's one of the most popular podcasts, but it's kind of got a niche audience. It's really unique. It's really weird. It's smart and clever humor. It's a fake radio show for a fictional town. It's not like a news report thing like what I've been talking about before. It's fiction, and it's this fake radio show about a spooky town named Nightville where these weird things happen. The show defies description. But I want to actually, for this one, it's the one time I want to play a clip. There's this one fake parody commercial they do. It's a send-up of Outback Steakhouse's motto, no rules, just right. And it kind of is a philosophical send-up of that motto. It goes really deep and really meta. Let me just play it for you now.
Here at Outback Steakhouse, we say, no rules, just right. Absolutely no rules. Food safety? Pfft. Federal law? Ugh. The laws of physics? What are you, a narc? It's weird here. The steak floats. Sometimes the steak is and also isn't simultaneously. Sometimes the steak is a chair, and we point at the chair and we say, that chair is a steak, and we make you eat it. That is the one rule. If we say something is a steak, you have to eat it, no questions asked. I know we said there are no rules, but that itself is a rule, and so is void. You want your philosophy non-contradictory? Go to Sizzler.
So, I'm not going to sit here and say Welcome to Night Vale has a lot of food content, but if that clip resonated with you at all, give it a listen. If it didn't resonate with you, then maybe don't spend your time with Welcome to Night Vale, because that is kind of what it's like. It's weird. You got to listen closely. It's almost too smart for me, but I can just about hang in there with it.
Just making fun of food marketing is really all the incentive I need.
Yeah, and they do that with everything. And it really is a great kind of, all right, let's take this tagline, no rules, just right, and let's really play it out. What would that mean? Oh, okay. It means that we're going to defy the laws of physics, and it means that it's a self-contradictory rule because it's a rule unto itself. I mean, whoever sat and listened to an Outback Steakhouse ad and went there, the writers, just kudos to them. I absolutely love it.
Hungry Dads.
Moving to what might be my favorite podcast. I'm going to say that about all these. It's a podcast called 99% Invisible. We've talked about 99% Invisible on the show before. In a Eater's Digest episode, I mentioned episode 137 called Good Bread. We reviewed it in episode 13, and it basically gave us the history of bread, particularly white bread, and that, white bread's kind of maligned in our culture. Most unhealthy thing you can eat. It's also like white bread is kind of like this term of phrase that might be an insult. This show is actually a design podcast. It's about design and architecture, but they'll talk about anything. And here, what they get into is that bread was made white as an artificial decision visually so that people would think it was pure and healthy, because this was a time where there was a public perception that bakeries were dirty, they were putting chalk in their bread, and so to make people want to eat it, they made it white. The host, Roman Mars, is one of my podcasting heroes. He's very enthusiastic about podcasts. So 99% Invisible, check it out. They've got some great food content. Here's my question for you, Rod. You should be able to get this one because I'll give you a hint. We talked about it before. What casual dining restaurant is most identified by a particular sound?
Yes, of course, that is Chili's with their sizzling fajitas. I believe they were the first ones to have the sizzling fajitas.
Exactly right. And that we talked about on our show as well. And it was talked about also on 99% Invisible, episode 148 called The Sizzle. And they just also discussed a book that was written by a couple of sound engineers who talk about how sound affects in advertising affects us. My question I'm not going to answer for you. What is Heyoon?
Gesundheit.
You're not going to know. I'll tell you what, it's not food related, but it's my favorite episode. Episode 83 of 99% Invisible, Heyoon. Check it out. Learn what Heyoon is all about.
Hungry Dads.
Rod, have you ever heard of The Slate? Do you know The Slate?
I do know The Slate. Not very well, but I have heard of it and read a few articles.
Yeah, they're a magazine and a presence on the internet. Kind of one of those, I don't want to say clickbait as if it's an insult, but one of those things you might see on your Facebook where they kind of have a headline that you might want to click on. They also have a podcast, and it's called The Gist with Mike Pesca. And it's kind of a general news, pop culture podcast, clever analysis of kind of what's going on right now. And they focus on food pretty often. And so one thing that they kind of pointed out one time was that if you look at movies and stuff, there's this trope. Do you know what I mean when I say trope? Oh, you don't know what trope means?
I'm an idiot.
Okay.
I didn't know I was better than you.
Well, if you don't know the word trope, folks, trope is a thing I guess they use it on TV or movies that kind of like you see it a lot commonly. On TV and movies, you always see people eating Chinese food out of those Chinese food boxes.
Yes.
And they basically said that's not how most people eat their Chinese food nowadays. Right. It's actually not often served in those. And they talked to some movie producers and directors who are like, yeah, just because it's a visual instinct and it's more interesting, that makes the people more interesting than eating it out of, a normal Tupperware or something.
And it's probably immediately identified as, oh, they're eating Chinese food.
Exactly. On The Gist with Mike Pesca, they have a great regular segment called Is It Bullshit? And on May 11th, 2015, they had an episode where they asked if artificial sweeteners were bullshit. Does it cause cancer? Is it any good for you? Is it bad for you? Is it better for you? What do you think, Rod? Are artificial sweeteners bullshit?
In my opinion, yes. My stance has always been, I know sugar is not great for you, but give me the naturally occurring thing versus some laboratory, chemically made specimen of something that I don't even know what it is.
Exactly. And so one thing that they shared about artificial sweeteners is that scientifically shown they don't cause cancer. It was a big belief that it causes cancer. It caused cancer in mice, but it was found that the physiological differences between humans and mice are so much that it does not cause cancer in humans. The other thing they kind of looked at was, are these artificial sweeteners successful in preventing weight loss? Are they healthy? Are they unhealthy? Does it not matter? And they talk about, kind of how these sweeteners affect your brain. If you want to know the final answer on whether or not they're healthy or whether or not they are in fact bullshit, I'm going to insist you listen to The Gist with Mike Pesca. Let's talk about a couple podcasts that are actually about food. I'm going to go back to NPR. This one's called The Sporkful. And this is a food-focused public radio show hosted by a guy named Dan Pashman. And he starts every episode with this tagline, which I think is awesome. It says, their podcast is not for foodies, it's for eaters. And I like that. It's not pretentious about food, but it is serious about food. I love that slogan, and it speaks to the show's tone. It's kind of serious, but it's still kind of fun, and it can be senseless too. They get into some interesting but kind of silly conversations about like office fridge politics, and but then also they might do something serious like asking, would free office coffee be more valuable to society than healthcare? Free office coffee, there's been studies about what that does for productivity and people's moods, and they kind of compare it to healthcare. Here's an interesting thing that I learned on the Sporkful. There's a flavor chemist. The same flavor chemist came up with both the Pizza Hut stuffed crust pizza and the McDonald's McGriddle. His name's Tom Ryan, and he is now the chief concept officer at Smashburger.
Wow.
Yeah, so
you would think with those two inventions he could do a little better than that. I don't know. That doesn't sound like a big promotion to me.
Chief concept officer. What do you think that person does?
Makes up foods, which sounds amazing.
So I don't know. Maybe we need to keep our eye on Smashburger. What their next idea coming out is going to be.
The stuffed crust hamburger. McGriddle.
They should stuff a burger with a McGriddle. So let me ask you this, and this comes from the people at Smashburger, and some other places have a philosophy on this too. But let me ask you, and maybe you can just be honest about the way you do it. When you've got raw ground meat and you're forming a hamburger, how do you go about creating that hamburger? Do you have any thoughts or insight as to what you might do?
It's interesting you ask this because we just recently bought a contraption that is for making the actual patties. I forget the brand, but it's this black round thing. You just put the meat in it, press it down, and then it pops out the other side. And it's great. They're uniform, beautifully round hamburger patties.
Round hamburger patties. Round like a
circular. Yes.
Round and flat hamburger patties.
Yes, although fairly thick.
Fairly thick. Okay.
I like a thick burger. Should they be square or something?
Does it pack the meat tightly or loosely or middle of the road?
It's a tight pack. It's a tight
pack. Interesting. And you do these on the grill?
I do grill them.
So you said you haven't been to Smashburger. Have you been to a Shake Shack? Are you familiar with Shake Shack? It's in New York.
I have been to Shake Shack. I'm familiar with it. A couple of times I've been to different locations around New York City. Okay.
And how about Five Guys? You familiar with Five Guys?
I've been to Five Guys many times.
Okay. Well, according to the Dan Pashman on the Sporkful and speaking with Tom Ryan, these Smashburger, Five Guys, and Shake Shack all kind of have the same philosophy with burgers. First, they use a flat griddle, which most of us don't have. So that might be the starting point. And I don't want you to feel insecure about your new device. But what they say is that what you want to do is you want to loosely pack the meat. And there's a thing called the Maillard reaction. And it caramelizes the outside of your burger and holds it together so that the loose inside meat will stay loose and tender and self-based. And as Tom Ryan described it, it'll explode like a water balloon of beef flavor.
Yeah, I know what they're talking about. It's very messy, but tasty.
And I think what I gather is it would be hard to do on a grill, like an outside grill, because the strategy is you basically make it a ball. It'll just all fall through like a three-dimensional ball. And the reason it's called Smashburger is because they slap it down on the grill first to take this loose ball and flatten it down and sear the outsides and keep the insides loose. So
it's interesting. I'll have to try Smashburger because I'm a big fan of In-N-Out. I think they're delicious. But Shake Shack, I think it's a good burger, but I think it's extremely overrated. I never got in the big Shake Shack hype. It's been wildly successful and is now a public company, so obviously people like it. I just thought it was overhyped.
From the Sporkful, let me ask you a question that I'm not going to answer for you. If you want to hear the answer, you're going to have to listen to the June 22nd episode. Here's the question. You're going to have to listen to the June 22nd episode that is entitled Tracing the Sausage Family Tree. Let me ask you, are hot dogs a sausage?
I'm going to say no, because if they were, it doesn't seem like an interesting question.
Well, let me put it this way. There's a debate to be had on it, and you can hear the debate on the Sporkful.
Hungry Dads.
The other particularly food-related podcast I wanted to share with our listeners is called Spilled Milk. And Spilled Milk is, I guess, arguably the one that's closest to our podcast. It's Molly and Matthew. They're these upbeat hosts, and every week they take a different type of food. One week it's pudding, the next week it's soy sauce, the next week it's apples, Indian food, shallots, or whatever. Every week it's a particular food. They break it down, they taste test it, they share kind of some memories about the food, maybe some recipes, but it's not a cooking show. They basically do a loving tribute to that day's food item. What's really refreshing about it is the hosts they're like really nice people. Molly and Matthew are just like really, really nice. They're not sarcastic or snarky, which kind of is much of the tone of a lot nowadays.
The Rod budget way.
Exactly. And they just really love the food, and they talk about it. And it's a little goofy, but I mean that as a compliment, not as an insult. They have food discussions, that I think we would love to join them on, Rod. They bring up, let me ask you, what do you think? Is Tabasco sauce on eggs, is that odd or normal? This is something that they spent quite a bit of time discussing.
It strikes me as odd, personally, but I've seen it. I put ketchup on eggs, so Tabasco isn't that big of a leap beyond ketchup.
Right, and this is the kind of thing that they would banter back and forth. They'd say, one says, yeah, it's not a road too far. The other says, hot sauce has no business on eggs. What's it doing at breakfast? They also actually did a great assessment of nachos. Rod, describe your ideal nachos to me.
My ideal nachos would have obviously a lot of good cheese on it. Probably a nice melted Monterey Jack or maybe cheddar or a combination of different cheeses. I like some refried beans on the nachos. And then probably steak, if I'm really, being indulgent and wanting my ultimate nachos. And that's about it. I don't like sour cream. I like guacamole on tortilla chips, but not so much on nachos. I don't like salsa on nachos. That makes the chips too soggy. So I'm pretty much a cheese and meat and bean guy.
What do you think about, so it's, from what you're describing, it sounds like it would be a shredded cheese, right? What about nacho cheese, the gooey stuff?
I like the gooey stuff as well, but it's hard to pull off with additional toppings, I think. But just like the ballpark kind of gooey nacho cheese is delicious, but if I had to choose, I think I would take being able to have the shredded melted cheese and some toppings.
Well, you are a sophisticated nacho man.
Also not a jalapeno guy, I should mention, because I know that's a popular topping.
I won't give away the ending, but they do a great assessment. They actually do a live taste test and review of some nachos, and they deal with shredded cheese nachos. They do some that they prepared in the oven, and then some that they prepared in the microwave. And there was a surprising final assessment on that I urge our listeners to check out their nacho episode.
Hungry Dads.
And the last podcast I'm going to talk about, and this is still not even an exclusive list of all the podcasts I listen to. I narrowed this down significantly. But the last podcast I want to talk about is one you might have heard of before, if not in podcast form, in other forms. It's the Freakonomics podcast. Have you heard of Freakonomics, Rod?
I have heard of Freakonomics and the Freakonomics podcast.
It is a fantastic podcast. I think I've said it several times already, but I'll say it again. It might be my favorite podcast. It's called Freakonomics. It's another economics-based podcast, but it's totally, totally entertaining. If you've ever experienced Freakonomics, you know that it's not boring numbers and money. They've had a bunch of food-related episodes. There's an episode entitled There's No Such Thing as a Free Appetizer, where they analyze why restaurants give away free bread. They ask the right questions. Is it an economically sound choice? Why not charge for the bread? Why have we come to expect free bread? Rod, we talked about free bread more than once on the show, but what do you think? Why do restaurants give away free bread?
I think it's a positive connotation. I think if you've never been there and they bring out bread, immediately you're like, all right, it's a free bread place. I'll remember that. And, maybe it's a decision that you're going to go back there. If there's a non-bread restaurant and a bread restaurant and they're similar in your mind, I'm going to go to the bread restaurant every time.
Wouldn't you think, because this happens in other industries, that the restaurants would kind of like get together and say, like, let's cut this free bread thing because, let's face it, bread fills up our customers. They don't order as much food. They don't order dessert. We're trying to offer them appetizers, but if we give them the bread, they're not going to get the free appetizer. They're not going to pay for appetizers. I find it surprising. I wonder this sometimes. The answer you gave is part of what they posit is just the competition of it. But how did it get to the point where this came to be something that they would even consider? I mean, they could just start giving away free drinks, and why don't they give away free drinks?
Yeah, it's an interesting phenomenon. I mean, I assume that it's historical in nature, and people ate bread before their meals in the past, and that's kind of how meals started. And if you didn't have bread before your meal, something was bizarre. So it's probably, if I had to guess, a historical thing that kind of has made its way into the 21st century.
Rod Budget, you are a genius. You've made up for some of your failings so far in this episode. You're actually exactly right. I'll kind of give you the answer they gave it, and it's pretty interesting and actually kind of unsurprising once you hear it. Before there were restaurants, there were places that it was called an inn basically, but it was a place where you didn't sit down and order from a menu. It was a place where you sat down and you just ate whatever they were serving that night.
Like a bed and breakfast kind of.
Yeah, and so what you do is you sit down, and that night every meal had 3 or 4 courses, and the last course was the meat, but the first course would be the bread. Bread's cheaper than meat. They want to fill you up on the bread, so you don't need as much. You don't expect as much of the expensive meat at the end of the meal. So this got into the public consciousness that you eat bread first, and during a certain evolution of the food service industry, restaurants tried to take away the bread, and people went bonkers and demanded their bread back.
Well,
and they went to the restaurants where they did, in fact, serve free bread. So we as Americans have just decided that free bread, and I think it's European too, decided free bread is just something we've come to expect.
Yeah, they try to take free bread away, and I'm picturing cars being flipped over and cities burning.
Let me talk about the July 3rd, 2014 episode, A Better Way to Eat. Have you ever heard of a guy named Takeru Kobayashi?
I have heard of Kobayashi. I did not know his first name, though.
Tell everyone who Kobayashi is.
Kobayashi is a professional eater. I believe he holds world records of all sorts of foods. I think he became well known from the Nathan's hot dog eating contest several years ago.
That's exactly right. And so they interviewed Kobayashi, or they call him Kobe, and fascinating interview, fascinating kind of retelling of his career and his training and his successes. And so, for instance, one of the things I didn't know before, and maybe you knew this already, but training for his first Nathan's hot dog competition, he was in Japan and he really couldn't find hot dogs, so he used rolls of minced fish to train for his first Nathan's competition. And when he got to his first Nathan's competition, he ate 50 hot dogs. That doubled the prior world record of 25. They accused him of using muscle relaxers to cheat. No one had ever creamed a world record like that before. He talks about his training regimen. He talks about his determination. He talks about why he started. Really interesting stuff. Let me ask you this, Rod. In the Nathan's hot dog eating contest, are condiments allowed?
I know they dip it in water, which I guess is a condiment, so I'll say yes.
Water aside, you're right. Water is allowed.
Are condiments allowed?
Ketchup, mustard.
I really don't know. I would think if they are allowed, nobody would use them because it takes time to apply them. But I'll say no, they're not allowed.
You were closer in the beginning. They are allowed, but as Kobe said, no self-respecting competitive eater would ever use them. But I found it surprising that they were actually even allowed. But I guess why not?
I guess it makes sense again from a historical standpoint when people weren't eating 50 hot dogs in a setting. It was probably the first one was probably normal people putting some mustard on some hot dogs and eating like 4 hot dogs.
Yeah, it's really ratcheted up. I got to say, I don't know the exact numbers, but the hot dog competition from 2015 just happened, and I know the winner ate more than 50.
Yeah,
so
I think it's gotten crazy.
It might have gotten into the 60s. So, I mean, look, this, Kobe kind of was broke a threshold here. Now, do you know anything about Kobe's strategy on eating the hot dogs?
Does he eat the dogs and then the bun, or vice versa? I vaguely remember something like that.
Yeah, I'm going to make you listen to the episode to get the dirty details, but it does involve dipping the bread in water. It does involve breaking the hot dogs in a certain way. Look, I mean, competitive eating is arguably very silly, and I'm not going to sit here and...
Kobe took it seriously, and he's made a lot of money off of it.
He revolutionized it, man. He trained like an athlete for this.
Hungry Dads! Visit our website at hungrydads.com. Follow us on Twitter at hungry_dads. This has been a Hungry Dads production.
This has to get edited out. But Rod Budget, you are a pig rectum.
Yeah, I'm certainly not the podcast expert that you are.